Welcome to the deep dive. We're diving into a pretty huge moment in U.S. history today, the attack on Fort Sumter back in April 1861. It might seem kind of small at first glance, just one fort, but it's seen as the event that really kicked off the Civil War. 4 years of brutal fighting, tons of casualties, and in the end, the emancipation of millions of people.
Absolutely. And the listener sources do a great job of showing us not only what happened when the cannons started firing, but also that bigger picture, like what led up to that point and made this clash so important.
Right, exactly. So, our mission today in this deep dive is to figure out why this wasn't just some random skirmish, why these first shots at Fort Sumter became the explosion that started a 4-year war. So, let's get into it. What had been going on for years that built up all this tension?
Well, to really understand Fort Sumter, you got to go back, even decades. There were so many attempts to solve the problem of slavery, to find some kind of compromise. The Missouri Compromise, the Compromise of 1850, all these big deals.
But they didn't really work, did they?
No, not really. They just kind of patched things up temporarily.
All right.
They didn't deal with the real issue, the expansion of slavery, and that just made the underlying tensions even worse. So what's interesting here is that these compromises were more like postponing the conflict than solving it. They gave people time to dig in and make their positions even stronger.
And then, boom, the election of Abraham Lincoln in 1860 seems like a major turning point. What made his win so significant in this already super tense situation?
Well, think about it from the South's perspective. Lincoln's election was like a direct threat to their entire way of life, which was, of course, built on slavery. He'd said pretty clearly that a nation couldn't survive being half slave and half free, and that spelled disaster for them. They saw their whole social and economic structure crumbling.
So it wasn't just political disagreement. The South was ready to walk away from the whole country.
Yeah, they were serious. South Carolina was like, we're out. They declared secession on December 20th, 1860. And that set off a domino effect. Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, Texas. By February 1861, 6 more states had bailed.
Wow, so they weren't messing around. They went ahead and formed their own country.
Yep, they did. In February 1861, they met up in Montgomery, Alabama, and created the Confederate States of America. They even picked a president, Jefferson Davis, a former senator from Mississippi. It was a big screw you to the U.S. government.
And they didn't stop there. They started taking over everything they could, right? All the federal stuff in their new territory.
You got it. Confederate militias started seizing U.S. forts, arsenals, anything they could get their hands on. That created a really dangerous situation, especially in important spots like Charleston, South Carolina, which, as the sources point out, was where all this secession talk really started.
So Charleston's right at the heart of this. What was it like there in early 1861?
Think powder keg.
Yeah.
South Carolina was saying, give us all the federal stuff here right now. But President Buchanan, he was still in office at the time, and he said, no way. He knew the feds were still in charge, even if things were falling apart.
And the harbor at Charleston, that was a pretty important place strategically, right?
Oh, absolutely. Charleston was the Confederacy's most important port in the Southeast. Whoever controlled the harbor controlled a lot. And in the harbor, you had these 3 big federal forts. Fort Sumter, sitting right in the main channel, Castle Pinckney, a bit closer to the city, and Fort Moultrie on Sullivan's Island, heavily armed. These were all third-system forts, the latest designs, built to withstand attacks from the sea. Thick walls, lots of cannons.
Now, the Union soldiers were first at Fort Moultrie, but then they moved, didn't they?
Yep, they did. Major Robert Anderson, the Union commander, was at Fort Moultrie with his men, but he realized something. Fort Moultrie, it was pretty vulnerable to attack from the land. Most of its guns were pointed out to sea. So on December 26, 1860, he did something bold. He moved his troops, about 90 of them, to Fort Sumter, out on an island in the harbor, much harder to attack from land.
And the folks in Charleston didn't take that too well?
You could say that. One guy from Charleston said it was like casting a spark into a magazine. Basically, things were already explosive, and this just lit the fuse. It showed the feds weren't going to back down, and that meant trouble.
And then you have the problem of supplies. The Union guys stuck out there in Fort Sumter, they were running out of everything.
Yeah, they were in a tight spot. They tried to send a ship, the Star of the West, to resupply them in January 1861. But as it was coming into the harbor, guess what? Cadets from the Citadel, that's the military college in South Carolina, they opened fire. The ship had to turn tail and run. It was a clear sign. The Confederacy wasn't playing around.
So things are getting really heated. Then, in March, Jefferson Davis sends Brigadier General P.G.T. Beauregard to take charge in Charleston. Sounds like they're getting ready for a fight.
Oh yeah, no doubt. Beauregard was a big deal, a well-respected military guy. Putting him in charge meant they were taking things very seriously in Charleston, and they were definitely preparing for war.
Then Lincoln becomes president. What does he do about Fort Sumter?
On April 4th, he lets the South know he's going to try to resupply Fort Sumter again. Those soldiers needed help, and he wasn't going to let them starve.
How'd that go over in Charleston?
Not, well, to say the least. The Charleston Mercury, a newspaper there, basically said resupplying the fort was the same as declaring war. Things were super tense, people were angry, and the rhetoric was getting fiery.
So the Confederacy had to make a move.
Yep. On April 9th, Jefferson Davis and his cabinet decide it's time to strike a blow. They tell Beauregard to demand the surrender of Fort Sumter, and if Anderson says no, take it by force.
So Beauregard sends his guys over to the fort. What happens?
April 10th, 3 of Beauregard's aides go to Fort Sumter and formally demand the Union garrison leaves. They were polite about it, but the message was clear.
And what'd Major Anderson say to that?
He was also polite but firm. He said, "My sense of honor and my obligations to my government prevent me from doing that." But he did tell them his supplies were critically low and would run out by April 15th. Basically, I might have to surrender then, but not because you're making me.
So the stage is set. Tell us about the attack itself.
Well, it all starts early in the morning on April 12th, about 4:30 a.m. Everything's quiet in Charleston Harbor. Then suddenly, boom, a mortar shell goes flying through the air, explodes above Fort Sumter. That was the signal. Then all hell breaks loose. Confederate cannons from all around the harbor, from forts and even ships, start raining down on Fort Sumter.
The Union guys were totally outnumbered, right?
Oh, yeah. Anderson had maybe 80 men. The Confederates had something like 500 plus way more cannons. The Union was outgunned, outnumbered, and low on supplies. But Anderson, he held his fire for a few hours.
When did they finally start shooting back?
About 7 a.m., Captain Abner Doubleday. You might know him from baseball history. Some say he invented the game, though that's debated anyway. He fires the first Union shot, a 32-pound cannonball aimed right at the iron battery on Cummings Point.
So then it's a full-blown battle.
For 36 hours straight, those Confederate guns just kept firing. There's this dramatic moment where a shell hits the fort's flagpole and the American flag falls down. But some brave Union soldiers run out and raise it again. It's a powerful image. The Confederates were even using hot-shot cannonballs heated up until they were red hot to try and set the fort on fire.
With the fort burning and running out of ammo, Major Anderson had no choice but to surrender.
It's a sad moment, but yeah. The surrender happens on April 13th at 2:30 p.m. And here's the crazy thing. The only deaths during this whole attack happened during the surrender ceremony. They were doing a 100-gun salute to the American flag, and one of the cannons explodes early. Private Daniel Hugh dies instantly, and another soldier is mortally wounded. So no one dies in the fighting, but 2 men die during the surrender. Talk about irony.
And even though the battle itself was relatively small, the attack on Fort Sumter had huge consequences, right?
Absolutely. It was like someone flipped a switch and the whole country went to war. As one of the sources puts it, the attack is over, but the war had just begun. And you know what? Fort Sumter stayed in Confederate hands for almost the entire war, until February 17, 1865. They tried to take it back many times, but it didn't work.
How did people react to the surrender in the North and the South?
Even though they lost, Major Anderson and his men were treated like heroes when they got back to New York. People admired their courage. On the other hand, in the South, Beauregard became a celebrity. They saw this as a big win, and he was the hero of the hour. He even got sent to command Confederate troops at the first big battle of the war, the First Battle of Bull Run.
So this event had a huge impact on everyone, not just the soldiers involved. It makes you wonder, what about the slaves? How did secession and the start of the war affect them and their owners?
That's a great question, and a really important one. At first, things were confusing. Some slaves tried to escape to Union forts, hoping for protection. But there wasn't any clear policy from the Union about what to do with them. Sadly, many were sent back to their owners because, legally, they were still considered property. The story of that teenager who made it to Fort Sumter only to be handed over to federal marshals, that really shows the messed up situation at the time.
I imagine things were pretty scary for the white folks in Charleston, too, especially the slave owners.
Oh yeah, there was a lot of fear and uncertainty. Some slaveholders hoped that their slaves would stay loyal, but many were terrified of a slave revolt. Mary Chestnut, she kept a diary, and she talks about this fear, how the slaves seemed so calm and emotionless, and it made the whites uneasy. Like, what were they really thinking? What were they planning?
So things were changing fast for everyone involved, but for the slaves, the biggest change was yet to come.
Right. As the war went on, more and more slaves escaped to the Union lines. The Union had to figure out what to do. At first, it was up to individual commanders, but then they realized something. Slave labor was helping the Confederacy fight the war. So on August 6, 1861, they made a big decision. They declared that runaway slaves were contraband of war, meaning they were no longer considered property. They were free, and they could even work for the Union Army.
That must have been a huge turning point for so many people.
It was. Slaves started fleeing to the Union in droves. By 1863, tens of thousands had made it to Washington, D.C., and by the end of the war, it was hundreds of thousands.
It's also amazing to think about the two commanders at Fort Sumter, Beauregard and Anderson. They knew each other, right? From before the war.
They did. Both of them graduated from West Point, the U.S. military academy. Anderson had even been Beauregard's artillery instructor there, and later, Beauregard was the superintendent of West Point. It's kind of wild to think about. This place, West Point, trained all these officers, and then they ended up fighting each other in a war that split the country in two.
It's like something out of a movie.
Totally. The whole West Point network was torn apart by secession. Southern officers like Beauregard felt they had to be loyal to their states and the Confederacy. Northern officers, even if they weren't totally sure about slavery, felt they had to defend the Union after Fort Sumter was attacked. You could see Beauregard leaning towards secession even when he was at West Point, and he resigned to join the Confederacy pretty quickly. Anderson, though, he stayed loyal to the Union, even though he was from a border state and had owned slaves himself.
It's fascinating how they still acted professionally, even when they were on opposite sides.
Yeah, you can see it in how they communicate before and during the attack. Like, Beauregard sends Anderson a formal notice just an hour before the bombardment starts. It's crazy.
Right.
The country's falling apart, they're about to fight, but they're still following military etiquette. And one more thing, something the sources point out. No one died during the actual siege of Fort Sumter. It's a strange contrast to the horrible bloodshed that was to come.
Let's talk about the fort itself for a minute. Fort Sumter, it was a pretty modern fort for its time, right?
Oh yeah, it was a prime example of a third system fort. After the War of 1812, the U.S. decided they needed better defenses along the coast. So they built these new forts, 5-sided, thick brick walls, tons of big cannons. Fort Sumter was put there to guard Charleston Harbor, along with the older Fort Moultrie.
But it wasn't even finished when the attack happened.
Nope. They started building it in 1829, but they ran into money problems and other delays, so it was still unfinished when South Carolina seceded in 1860. That definitely affected how well it could defend itself.
And we talked about how the Union moved their troops from Fort Moultrie to Fort Sumter, thinking it was safer.
Right. Major Anderson made that call because Fort Moultrie was easy to attack from land. Fort Sumter, being on an island, was much harder to get to. But, like the sources say, it wasn't perfect. Most of its guns were facing the sea, so the Confederates attacked from the land. It wasn't as strong as it could have been.
So all this time, the Confederates are telling the Union to get out of Fort Sumter, and the Union's running out of food and everything else.
Exactly. The Confederates kept saying surrender, but the first resupply attempt failed, remember? And then Lincoln says he's going to send more supplies, which just makes the Confederates even angrier. They see it as a challenge.
And in the end, they decided they couldn't let the Union stay there any longer.
That's the key. The Confederates saw the Union staying in Fort Sumter as a direct insult, a sign they didn't respect their authority. So they launched the attack on April 12th. The sources say they fired something like 3,000 artillery shells at the fort over those 36 hours. It was a huge bombardment. And even though the Confederates won that first fight, Fort Sumter was important, and they held on to it for almost the entire war.
So, looking back on everything, Fort Sumter might have been a small battle, but it was a major turning point in U.S. history.
It really was. You had decades of arguments about slavery, both sides digging in, and a series of events that just pushed them closer to war. And then, bam, those first shots at Fort Sumter changed everything.
It's like the whole country was a powder keg, and Fort Sumter was the spark that set it off.
Exactly. What's fascinating is that this single event had such a huge impact. It hardened the divisions between North and South, and it made both sides realize that this was going to be a long and brutal fight.
It makes you think, could things have gone differently? Could the Civil War have been avoided? What do you think, listener? After everything we've talked about, the failed compromises, the stubbornness on both sides, the events that led to that April in 1861, was the attack on Fort Sumter inevitable? Or were there moments, maybe earlier on, where different choices could have been made, choices that might have led to the different path, a path that avoided all that death and destruction?